All right. Hopefully we're good to go now, I think. Just allow some people to come in, and I think I have the glitches worked out. Okay, and it's not really glitches. This is user error this time. So I'm just learning, so bear with me. And I'll be watching for your comments. Um, if you are just joining in, be sure to put in the comments where you're from, and if you can see me and hear me properly, I'd like to know that. This is a little bit new for me, the YouTube live. I've been doing the Facebook live, but it's not been going so well with the tech problems. So I would like to know if you can hear me, if you can see me well, if it's streaming well. I would like to know. It seems to be. It says I have excellent streaming health, so uh, hopefully that's good. All right. So for those of you that may not know me, I'm Shelley Pryor. I'm a watercolor artist in Ontario, Canada. And I paint a lot of high realism, a lot of glass and things that you can see behind me here. I'm in my studio. It's kind of a rainy day today. And one of the things I thought would be fun to paint together would be these wonderful dandelion seeds. I'll have you know, I grew these myself. So we actually back onto a field, and the field isn't that maintained, so it is loaded with dandelions. And of course, oh, thank you, Verna. I'm so glad. Oh, I'm glad you found me. Thank you. Yeah, I know. I'm kind of making out all of you switch over to YouTube, and hopefully we won't have any glitches now. I think I figured out what I did wrong, but I don't know. I'm pretty sure it's going to be okay. So thank you so much for joining me. If you are just tuning in, please make a comment and say where you're from. Um, our dandelion crop is doing pretty well. Actually, our whole garden's doing well. It's um, uh, it's been a spring that the flowers seem to really like this year. The lot of blooms on many of my bushes and stuff. Um, so I can't complain about the dandelions. So anyway, what I'd like to do here is switch over to my um, work area here, and my reference, which you can see right here. And I guess I can take the keyboard out of the way. And here we go. So I'll talk about my reference material, and what I have done to prepare for this. And I am using Arch's 140-pound cold pressed paper. What I've done is I have soaked it in the sink. This is, approximately 9 by 11, this piece of paper. And I soaked it in my sink in room temperature water for about 3 minutes, and pulled it out of the water, let the excess drip off, and I set it down on this piece of gator board. Gator board is a very hard but lightweight board that I use. And I use a regular stapler, and I staple all the way around as quickly as I can because it starts to wrinkle almost right away. And then I leave it to dry overnight. And when I come back in the morning, it's completely flat. So that's great. And so I like the cold press. This is a bright white paper that I'm using. I could be using the natural white. I just don't happen to have any on hand. And my palette is, these are tube acrylics that I have poured into a empty palette that I purchased. And yay, thank you, Debbie. Good morning. So I'm using mainly Da Vinci watercolor paints here, but I do have some Winsor Newton in here as well. And what I've done is I have, basically arranged them more or less in a color wheel type of format. So I've grouped all my yellows together, my reds together, my greens together, my blues together, etc. And you know, when I want to work with this, of course, all of those dry quite hard after a short time. So I take a little eyedropper, you know, it's one of these little pipette things, and I add a generous amount of water to each of the wells, and I leave it for about 10 minutes or so, at least 10 minutes, and allows that paint to sort of soften up. But I have to put a generous amount on, because if you just use a spritzer, all it does is it wets the top of it, and then that evaporates. It doesn't really get into the paint and soak it and soften it up like it's right out of the tube. That's the only way you're going to get the rich colors, to use gooey paint. All right, so yeah, hopefully a few more can find me as we go along. I'm sure more people will sort of get used to this switch over. If you're not familiar, some of you might be joining me from YouTube, and I have been doing a Facebook Live every Wednesday morning at 10 a.m. Eastern Time, but after multiple weeks of kind of glitches I've been having, I'm going to try just placing a link there to my YouTube channel. So if you're new here, welcome. Thank you very much for joining. Our subject today is this really soft dandelion. So now that we have talked about most of the materials, we'll talk about a couple more. I'm going to use a nice big brush for wetting my paper. This is a big, wide, I don't know, 2-inch wide basting brush, actually, which you can buy them at the art store and pay a lot more for, but I actually bought this at a grocery store. And for wetting the paper, it's perfect. I will be using a selection of, you know, round brushes, okay, some round brushes. This one holds a lot of water. This one's a synthetic hair. This one's squirrel hair. And then this one is a synthetic brush. So it won't hold as much water, but it's good for details and things like that. So, you know, it has a little bit more spring to it. This one tends to sort of stay flopped over when it's wet. But it comes to a really nice point when it's wet. So I'm going to sit down. I do this with every painting I do. I sit down and I look at this and I'm thinking to myself how I'm going to paint it. All right. So if you don't think it through, you could run into all kinds of problems. So I'm going to think about how I'm going to work on this. And I'm looking at this dandelion fluff. Now this maybe it's a different variety or something, but this one's kind of creamy colored. It's not really white. So, and I kind of like that, you know, it kind of looks nice. But these were really big dandelion heads. And then I have this super dark but gorgeously modeled background here. So when I work into this, I'm going to be using really dense, heavily pigmented color for the background. I'll be using a much paler color in the foreground. Now, how the heck am I going to get that softness? Well, working wet into wet is almost always the right way to go when you're trying to get the softness. Either that or you paint onto a dry surface and then you soften as you go. Pardon me. So first thing, maybe I will just take a pencil and just sketch a little bit here, just so I know the placement of my dandelion. The one thing I don't like about this composition is how they're like bookends, like they're exactly the same. So I'd like to maybe move one down and one up a little bit, just to make this composition a little bit more interesting. And then I can just basically use this as a reference for the materials. So, all right, so I'll put one head right here. So put that one there and have this come down. I don't want it to come down in a perfectly straight line, so I'll make it a little bit curved. And then maybe this one's going to be a little higher. All right, so there's the middle of my head. So my dandelion's going to be approximately this large. I'm trying to draw a circle around this to give myself an idea. I was trying to shift it over so it's not dead center as well. Sometimes when you're taking pictures with your phone, you kind of need to center it in order for the camera to focus in the right place, or you can touch your screen and choose where you want it to focus and that sort of thing. But as it happens, this one ended up in the middle. So I'm going to, first of all, wet this, and then I will be applying my light colors first, so I'll be working light to dark. So I'm going to get my creamy color, but maybe before I wet this, I will mix that up. And I'm going to maybe go for raw sienna. I think raw sienna would be a nice color in that middle there. I also see little hints, I know you're going to think I'm crazy, little hints of blue in there. So I'm going to get a little bit more mixed up here. And some of the little bit of blue. And fairly diluted because I want the color to be light. All right. So welcome if you're just joining me. I see that the numbers are going up a little bit here, and I know it takes a while for people to find you when you've made a change like this. But yeah, please let me know you're here and where you're watching from. I always enjoy seeing that. So I've got those colors ready, and then I'll have some real darks that I'm going to need to put in here, and there's a whole assortment. But when I look at this background, I see blues and yellowy greens, and definitely some really good darks in here too. So I'm going to go with, for my yellowy greens, I'm going to use Aureolin. Let me move this out of the way. Aureolin. Aureolin's a nice sort of cool yellow, very vibrant, and when you mix that with Payne's Gray, you get a gorgeous green. Good morning, Liz. Welcome. Thank you for joining. All right. So, and I've got some blues. I think I'm going to need a little more blue in my blue puddle here. All right. Any reds? No, not really. Not at this point anyway, not for the first stages. All right, so then I'll be needing quite a bit of some dark color, my Payne's Gray. I think I'm not even going to pull my Payne's Gray into my palette because I want to use thicker, richer paint. So I'm not going to bring it out into my palette. I'm just going to paint right from my well, because it's going to be very creamy and almost buttery consistency when I put that when that Payne's Gray goes down. All right, so here we go. I am going to wet the whole paper, and I like this big brush because it holds a lot, and it can cover a lot of ground quickly because it's large. And I'm kind of just scooping up the watercolor, or the water, and I'm going to let a little bit of this kind of get into the paper first. I find very often beginners will take their water and then they jump right into their paint and they start putting it on, and what's happening is that the water is already starting to go into the paper and it's pulling the paint with it, so it starts pulling it in and it starts to get a little bit patchy because the paper itself isn't ready for all that wet color yet. Some of it has to get into the core of the paper so that it can suspend and keep the paint on top long enough for you to manipulate it, right? Otherwise you're just going to paint it on, and you really won't have a lot of control at first because it will be so wet. So so it's really wet and it's going to go in there. Let me talk about a couple of other things that I would like to use in this particular project. And one of them is ordinary kitchen salt. So I put it in a little container here, but I love using salt on my paintings. It gives an effect that your brush just can't seem to achieve. And so I love to do that. Hi, Barb. Hi, Melody. Oh, thank you so much for coming. And I'm not a big fan of using white, but in this case, I think some opaque white would be a really nice addition to this. So my label's completely worn off, but this is P.H. Martin's Bleed Proof White. So I'll put that, I'll maybe type that in there so you can see. Martin's Bleed Proof White. All right, so that's what I'm using, P.H. Martin's Bleed Proof White. That's what I will be using, but just not yet. All right, so I'm going to come in now with my light color. Ugh, my brush wasn't clean enough. Let's try this one more time. I got distracted and didn't rinse my brush, so let's get some more raw sienna. Let's try this again. All right, so you can see my paper is beginning to wrinkle a little bit. That is completely normal, completely normal. You can see the ripples in it. And not to worry, because I have pre-stretched my paper, the staples will hold that down, and when it dries again, it will be tight as anything. So let's go. So I'm going to start with just some little lines to indicate my seed heads, I guess, or my seed stems. Just sort of get my bearings for for this painting. I thought about using masking fluid, but I really felt that if I used masking fluid on this, it might be just too harsh. That is the one thing about masking fluids. It gives you those really, really crisp lines, those really telltale lines. Good morning, Jan. Good to see you. You probably have the same rainy day we do over there in Brighton. So let me get a drink here. I really should do vocal exercises before I start going live, right? All right, so I'm going to start thinking about some of those light areas in the background. Pardon me, I'm going to mute for a second and cough. All right, so I'm going to use some bright yellows in here, and they are going to seem overkill at the moment. But, oops, went into the wrong yellow. Oh well, I'll use another yellow too. That won't hurt anything. I could put any colors in there I want. It's my painting. Let's move that out of the way. And I'm going to go into some blues and add blues in here. The blues will help create some of the greens as well. Now I do have this paper really quite wet. So when you wet your paper, it really will buy you a lot of time. And this looks horrible right now. Yes, I know. And that's perfectly normal. 1 second. Okay, I'm back. All right, so now I'm going to go into some of this Payne's gray, and let's see what we get when we start putting some of this Payne's gray in. And you can see I'm going in really quite dense here. I'm letting it sort of splash and play around here. Really want to get some of these darks going here. right. All right, so I'm going to I'm going to blot my brush off here and do a little bit of this kind of thing, just to sort of start defining the shape of the dandelion pod. I don't know, they call it a pod? I suppose so. I want to try and get the shape. Now, the thing is that, you know, it's a little bit see-through and everything, and I want to get some of the, I want to get some of this color into the middle. So in between some of what I did previously, I'm going to put in some of those same colors. Trying not to make them all spaced evenly and everything. Let's pull some of that out. Right. And I'm just randomly placing colors everywhere. And I started with the bright colors because if I put the light colors on top of the dark, you see it just gets really, doesn't really get light again. It just changes the dark. But I can definitely do that. I can alter some of those darks in there so that they are more interesting. Put some of the blues in there and things like that. And it's kind of a mess right now. That's the hard part, I think, about watercolors, learning to let the paint flow, and that feeling of out of control. Oh my gosh, we're out of control. And you know, but once you kind of get used to that idea, it kind of gets fun, you know. You can, you know, the more playing around you do with watercolor, the more used to the that play of color and that flow, you just get used to it. So let's here, we'll mix up a couple of things and put a couple more colors in here. What a mess I'm making, and it's totally fine. So I'm going to put in a little bit more of this raw sienna, because I think the raw sienna so far is looking a little weak. So I'm going to put a little bit in here just to get this a little bit stronger. It's dry, it's always going to dry lighter. I'm just playing here right now, so this is kind of fun. And I'm going to put a little bit more sort of around the circumference of the seeds. Looks like this one's going to end up being the bigger one. All right, so now I'm going to get the fun stuff out. I'm going to get the salt out. And I'm going to start very deliberately placing it in a circular pattern here around each pod. And with the timing is quite important when you do this as well, because if you go too soon, all it does is just sort of soaks into the salt, and it doesn't really make an effect. But what I do when I am trying to find the right timing is I will just keep adding. And if I keep adding, eventually I'm going to hit the right time. This needs to come over here a little bit more. So just pinching it in my fingers and placing it. And I don't really mind if this gets to be a, you know, strong effect. I think it could be very, very interesting. And the fun part about this is you never know how it's going to turn out. It's just, you know, just totally play. All right. Now, the thing with salt is you have to wait. Good morning, Diana. How are you? I'm glad you found me. All right, so in this background, now this background I'm finding it looks a little starbursty. So I'm going to take some of these colors and see if I can make a little bit more of a bokeh background. For those of you that don't know what a bokeh background is, and it's spelled B-O-K-E-T, no, E-H, pardon me, B-O-K-E-H. And what that is it's actually the effect of that you get with a camera, where you get these kind of like these light circles, and sometimes they're different colors. So what I'm doing here is I'm just sort of lifting out a bit of color in some of these areas in the background in a circular bubble type of effect. And I'm doing this while this is wet, so that everything will be nice and soft. And I need to do this with a blotted brush. It's going to take a while for this salt to do its thing. Now I can see it starting. It's beginning. It's beginning. It takes a while for it to really begin to do its thing. Oops, let's try not to drag too much of a outline on this. I'm just pulling out some circular shapes in this background so that it doesn't look too much like a starburst. And they don't need to be perfect circles, and they don't need to be all the same size or spaced all the same or anything like that. They can be, you can have some big ones like this. So big ones, small ones, some that are really close together. I just keep wiping this off on my paper towel. Oops. And I've got a kind of one big blob here in the corner, so let's break that up. And if I have any spots that, you know, maybe I want to make this one a little bit more blue, I can add that in. As long as I don't put in wetter paint than the paper, but so far everything's really wet. So this is just playing and having a lot of fun. So maybe a bit more than I want. So a little push and pull. Put it on. If it's too much, take it off. Sometimes if the paper's really wet, it'll just fill back in. You just come back and revisit it and pull off more. So some are off the page. So I'm using a brush that will hold a lot. This is a squirrel hair brush. And yeah, so I just keep going at this as it's drying, and always making sure my brush is a little drier than the paper itself. Not trying to make it too identical to the, you know, the reference is really just a reference. It's not the painting itself. So I'm not trying to duplicate it. I'm trying also not to get into a lot of my salt here. But I can create some beautiful effects even with spattering water. So spattering water is actually going to give me a little bit of a different effect than the circles that I was making. So I will just sort of tap on a few spots here in the background to get that effect. Might as well tap in the middle too. And the timing is means a lot here, because you can go in too early and you can go in too late. So usually about the right time to spatter, to throw in your salt, is when the paint is just a little bit sticky. It's just beginning to dry. It's hasn't dried. It's just got that little bit of a shine to it, and it's still a little bit thin. So, ooh, I can see the effect is happening here. Now, the one thing about salt is that you kind of have to wait for it to do its thing. You can't take a dryer to it and speed that up. That's one of those processes where the salt just has to keep absorbing. So you might be wondering, well, yeah, but what about all that salt on your paper? Isn't that bad for your paper? Well, it doesn't stay on there. So I'm going to be taking this off. And one of the ways that I take it off is just using a palette knife. I have a little bit bigger one that I use, but I just will, when it's completely dry, I will scrape that off. But you can see the wonderful effect that's happening around this. And when this has created enough effect that I like, I could take the dryer to it then. The one danger to taking the salt off too early is you can see that some of these have gotten quite dark. Now let me zoom in on this so that you can see this a little closer. All right, so you can see the effect that's happening from the salt. I probably, if I wanted to, I probably could even put in a little more. But look at the middle here. Look, great effect that's happening here. But it's only going to work on wet paint. Here, just be generous with this in the whole thing. Let that absorb. All right, so I'm going to wipe off my edges because that's going to make a mess. And I'm just going to give it a couple more minutes so that this can dry. I don't know, do many of you ever use salt in your paintings? Did you have success with it? Let me know. Okay, I always wipe these edges off because any of the paint that sits on that tape, because it's not going to dry very fast on the tape, so I always wipe that off so that it doesn't get on and create unpleasant blossoms. Now, in this kind of a background, it probably wouldn't matter, but in a lot of cases, I've made it a habit because it keeps my edges from doing things I don't plan on or don't want it to do. All right, so I am working flat, by the way. I'm not working on a slanted board or anything like that. And ooh, so this is starting. I mean, you can actually watch this happen, right? You can see the wonderful effects that I'm getting around the edges here. That's kind of fun. Yeah, but this is going to have to dry on its own, I think. Yeah, some of these big blobs here, you can see where it's dark. That's just absorbed a lot of paint. You know, I put that on when that was quite wet. So I don't want to disturb that because it ends up smearing, right? Because every granule of salt holds on to an awful lot of paint and a lot of moisture. So, you know, salt is very drying as it retains water. We all know this, right? So it absorbs a lot of water, but it holds on to it for a long time too. So you really have to make sure it's absolutely dry before you take it off. And yeah, unfortunately, that's one of the things we have to do is wait. So I'm going to try another little bit of spatter and see if I can get a little bit more effect in the background. And this, you'll see that this effect will look slightly different than the salt effect. Let me see if I can pull a few more of these out as well. Sometimes you just have to stick with it, and then when the surface of the paper gets to just the right moment, then this lifting off works really well. Oops. The idea is to get these lighter, not darker like that. So I need to lift that off so I don't have dark. Also don't want rings around them, so get rid of that. Any dark lines around the outsides. Okay, so you get the idea of the softness in this and the bokeh background, and you've all seen this effect. Like you've had pictures where you get sort of the light hits objects in the distance, and they're out of focus. So the camera lens just makes them go all fuzzy and circular, and it's a beautiful effect. It gives you this lovely softness, and you can throw in all kinds of colors. Wonderful for things like city night scenes and things like that. You can get this wonderful effect. Yes, Debbie, it is very unpredictable. I'm hoping this is going to work out, but you never know, right? So now I'm looking at this going, what can I do? And that's the danger, right? What can I do? What can I play with? I'm bored. I want to play with something. And there comes a time when you just gotta sit on your hands and go, okay, I gotta wait. I gotta wait. So while we're waiting, let me tell you a little bit about my watercolor history. Um, I have been painting. Hi, Gloria. Um, I have been painting since I was little. I think my grandmother said to me, "You're going to grow up to be an artist," and I kind of listened to her. And oh, naturally, it was my one of my favorite subjects in school. When I got to high school, I could only pick, um, I think one or two art related topics, and I was so torn. I thought, do I go into music or do I go into art? Well, since I had to pick one, I went into art, and I do continue with music a little bit, but I'm nothing. And so I went into art. I went to animation. I went into animation. I thought that would be fantastic working for Disney or whatever, because Disney at that time had just opened up a studio in Toronto. Well, before I graduated, they pulled out of Toronto, and it didn't look like the prospects of having any Canadian um, jobs was going to be too likely. And so I didn't want to move to the US after living here my whole life, and family and friends all here. So I decided to go into fine art. So I went into fine art, and guess what my worst subject was? Watercolor. It was absolutely awful. my my instructor gently came up and patted me on the shoulder. She goes, maybe you'd like to try acrylic. So I did. I tried acrylic, and that was a little more manageable, right? It stuck where I put it. and and I did a little bit of acrylic and stuff, and then I went on and I worked as a commercial artist, and I did that for several years. And I started my family. Anyway, in that time, I didn't pick up watercolors again. So we're talking a good span of 8 years or so. I never picked up watercolors. But when I decided to stay home with my kids, and I got kind of eager to try it again. And this time I decided to go at it with a vengeance. And I think this is key here. I think the thing you need to really be a good watercolor artist is maybe 5% talent, but I think 95% has to be determination. Because if you're determined, if you want it bad enough, you go out, you learn it. And that's what I did. I just loved it. I loved how it looked. I loved the glow, and I could see these watercolors that were absolutely glowing. I couldn't figure out how to do it, and I just thought, I'm going to learn this. And so I went to the library and I took out VHS tapes at the time. So I took out VHS tapes, and I joined local art guilds. I went to I went online. I got my first computer and I went online and I joined some watercolor groups, and I started finding all these other people and other ways of doing things and different ways that people explained things to me. And I thought, oh, well, if it had been explained to me that way when I was in college, I wouldn't have given up. And it's not the sort of subject that you're going to go and suddenly go, okay, I got it. You know, it's little bites here and there everywhere. And it takes years. Well, it did for me anyway. It took years of experimentation and a whole lot of failure before I actually got all these little aha moments, you know, when I started figuring things out. So be patient with yourself. If you're newer to watercolor, be patient and yet be determined. So I know that's a little bit of an oxymoron, because when you're determined, you want it now. But be patient. It comes if you want it. So that's the key, if you want it. And so I started teaching. And when I'm teaching, as much as possible, I try to explain things in a couple of different ways. So sorry if I repeat myself a lot. But I try to share with you the things that I wish had been explained to me in the same way. So I'm looking at my piece here now. Most of the shine is gone. It's not all gone. You can see that there's still some shine left on it. But I think my salt effect is pretty good right now. I don't know that I really need it to do a whole lot more than this. So I'm going to take my dryer to it and dry this. So bear with me for a minute. I'm going to, I'll turn down my volume. Okay, so hopefully, now when I start drying anything, I will always start like well away from my painting. I will hold the dryer maybe 12 inches away from my surface. Only as it starts to dry a little bit more, will I get a little bit closer. So I was trying to get a little closer to my salty areas here to get them dry, but you can see that they're a little bit dark. So yeah, this might have had a little bit of moisture hidden underneath, so I may have to dry this a little bit more. And I'm only using, I know it sounds rough, but I'm using a very gentle motion here. I don't want to damage my paper. I just want to get the salt off. Just a little noisy. So get most of this into the garbage, not all over the place. It only sounds loud. It's not aggressive scraping. It's just, I'm actually just resting the palette knife on my paper. And so far, this looks, sorry, forgot to turn my phone notifications off. All right, so I've got all this wonderful texture and stuff that's happening here, but it doesn't look like anything yet. So let's start building a little bit of structure in this. I'm going to take my, I think, I'm looking at my reference here, and I'm looking at the stems and stuff, and it's a little reddish, and up in here, I think maybe a little bit more raw sienna, but also I'm going to say maybe some burnt sienna. So raw sienna and burnt sienna. So I'm going to just come in and start making my stem. Now, some of this will get really sort of soft. So I'll just rinse my brush and paint a little part of it with just clean water. And then I'll come back and I'll get more paint and put more paint in there. You know, just let some of the areas look like they're kind of see-through. Do you see that, how I lifted that off? Just pulled some of that off and made that look a little see-through. You know, this is really kind of what you need to do, is have a lot of soft edges when you're trying to paint something that looks as soft as a dandelion head. So, okay, so the center is right about here. And I'll put a few little lines, and I'll do the same sort of thing. I'll lift off a little bit as I go to keep things looking a little bit like they're behind the fluff, not in front of. So if I just do straight lines, it looks like it's in front of the fluff. So thank you, Debbie. Oh, thanks, Nancy. Oh, I'm glad you made it. Okay, so now this is looking a little bit too orange, so I'm going to take a little bit of that Payne's Gray, mix it into my burnt sienna, which will make it quite dark, And I'm going to add in, you know, a few little darker spots. And the more Payne's gray I add in, the darker it's going to look. So really get a couple of little darks in there. I think getting a few darks in there is important. So I've got everything from like almost a black kind of color to something very, very soft. So I'm just going to continue around my dandelion and create some of these soft little stems, I guess. But I really want to make sure I'm keeping some edges soft. So I can hear the rain outside. It's a great day for painting. Let's lift a little light area in the middle of that. Maybe one here. Right? So that's what makes it look like it's tucked in. So you want to make sure whenever you're using a color like this, or when you're putting in lines like this, you want to make sure that they're liftable. In other words, that they're not a staining color. If they're a staining color, they don't lift very well. Hence the name staining, right? So this is going to have this really soft, ethereal type of look about it, hopefully. Let's see, I'll just go quicker here and put a few more in. Rinse and soften a few bits. There'll still be a little ghosty type of bit in that dandelion, but you can see how effective that will be. So I'm using a dry paper towel and just sort of lifting bits and blotting them off. Cool. Okay, so I'm going to keep coming in with some of this same color. Add a few more. There's some areas that get pretty dense, and some of them are lighter, some of them are darker. They seem to be a little darker along the bottom. So kind of went too far there. I want to make sure the ends don't look like they just stop abruptly too. This one looks a little abrupt. They're trying to keep all of this nice and soft. So hopefully you're starting to get the idea of this dandelion. So little seed heads are here. Now, where each of the little I don't know what you call it, the downy part on the top, the center of that, all, you know, the ones that face you have little dots. So I'm going to have a few that are going to be just kind of like dots. Just a few places, just a couple of dots. Don't want to space them evenly or anything like that. But there's a few dots here and there. Made a really wiggly line there. Straighten that out. Okay, so you'll notice I haven't made everything the same length either. There will be different lengths of these seed heads, I guess you're calling it. All right, so one down, and let's get the other one done. And then we'll start coming in and we'll be trying to get some a little bit more definition to the what do you call it, the white fluff. Okay, so this one's a little taller. I'm leaving a couple of gaps so that I can soften that. Blot my brush. Blot it off. Right? We want to interrupt that. You know, it's like when you put a tree trunk in a tree, right? You stop and start kind of thing. Same kind of thing. And the seed head here, it's pretty dark. And we're going to do the same sort of thing. Rinse, soften, especially the ends, I think. Could use a little softening. I've seen a lot of other ways of going about doing this. This is just one, you know, and I'm just kind of playing and having a little bit of experimental fun with salt and stuff to, you know, see if I can get that really cool edge here, which I love this edge right here. I think that that's really pretty. It's not exactly like the photo, but I don't care. It's a painting, right? So right, quickly rinse and blot and soften a bit here and there. Now, if you're using colors and you're not sure if they're staining or not, try doing this just on a separate piece of paper. Don't start working on your painting that you've been, you know, building for the last hour or so, and only to find out it doesn't lift. Make sure you test it out. Maybe you mix your own version of a burnt sienna type color, so you would need to test this. Just pulling some of that off so that it breaks that up. And I am working on dry paper as I do this. The softening comes from my damp brush only. Okay, so there's a lot of little seeds, so I might have to do quite a few of these. Okay, I'm liking how the effect is turning out. Nice, and sorry, I keep sliding down here as I'm working. At least I haven't gone off the page. Well, actually, I could move this down and that would be better. Need it a little closer to me to work. There we go. Oh, thanks. Thanks, Pam. All right, so I'm going to take a few more and get those little sort of dots in to some of these places. That's the centers of some of these seed heads. All right, so now I want to take my white now. Let's get my brush rinsed out here. And my white, it's P.H. Martin's Bleed Proof White, which I put up earlier in the chat if you want to look there. And this now I use directly out of the tube, or out of the jar. And so I think I'll use a smaller brush for this, a round. And you can use this either sort of full strength and it'll cover, or you can thin it. Now, here's the problem though. As I said earlier, this painting, or this photograph, whatever, these seed heads really aren't that white. I did get a little bit in there. I think I'm going to start with some white, and if it's too white, I'm going to tint my white a little bit. But I'm going to go for now right into my paint. And what I see in my picture is these little sort of scoops, right, all around each of those little bits there. So I'm going to see if I can sort of duplicate that effect. Damp brush, dip it right into my paint here. And anything that I put on here is I can soften. So if I put some of these on, and I'm only going loosely by my reference. I'm not trying to make it exactly the same. But any of these can be softened as I go, or even after. This is one thing. P.H. Martin's Bleed Proof White is one thing that will reconstitute extremely easily. So I can easily come in and tone this down. But what I want to try to do is create the look of this circle with this effect. Right, so, and I don't normally love using white in my watercolors, but I think because the fluff of the dandelion is almost like a little see-through veil, I think it works quite well that it's slightly opaque and will cover some of what's there. So this is an instance where this can work quite nicely. That looks a little messy, but I'll soften this. So hopefully you can start to see the effect of those seeds. I hope you can see it. I can see I need a little bit more work on the stems and stuff. And these seeds do overlap, so you know this area in here is going to get quite dense with a lot of that fluff going on here. So got a bit of a had a bit of a blob on there, so I had to take it off. And actually, I think there's enough of the that creamy color showing through from the first washes that I did, and the fact that I'm not putting this on 100% opaque is working out okay. So I may not have to, and yet still some of that salt texture is going to show. Let's thin this a little bit more, just with a bit of wetter brush. Right, so I'm going to rinse that off, and let me show you what softening some of this will look like. So I just come in with my brush and I just sort of soften some of this. Right now they look like pretty harsh lines, but this will turn it a little bit, the paint a little bit milky, and give us some really nice soft effects, and almost like a veil of color. Everything underneath will still show through, but it will have this really nice softness, and I really quite like that a lot. All right, so it's getting quite soft. Let's get a little more of this one done. So kind of like a losing battle at our house with the big field behind us. It gets cut maybe once a month. So they get a little bit out of control. But it means that we don't have neighbors directly behind us, which is nice for privacy. Either side of us, but not behind us. So you can see I don't have to put this on that carefully because I'm going to soften it anyway. Now, I think one thing that I could have done a little bit better is made my background a little darker. And maybe I can still do some of that, but we shall see. So right now I'm just painting this one as if this one's not even here. And then I'll do the same for the other one. Sounds like it's really raining out there. Windy too. Or maybe I just hear the wind more now that we have leaves on the trees. All right, so coming in a little bit stronger with some of this. A couple of lumps in there. This bleed proof white is the strangest stuff. It when it dries, it almost crystallizes, and you think, oh my gosh, it's ruined, like it won't be any good anymore. But then I add more water to it and leave it, it takes quite a while, you know, kind of like your watercolor paint here. You have to add water to it and it will soften up again. So all right, so this is starting to look like a dandelion, but I do think some of my background is still a little bit too a little bit too wet, too light. So I may come in and add a little bit more in there. And let me get a little bit more on this dandelion. Now, I would be doing this probably a lot more slowly, carefully, if I weren't doing it as a demonstration, just so you know. But it really won't matter that it's a little bit sort of painterly and loose. I think that's quite lovely sometimes. Now I'm painting this dandelion like that one's not even there, so overlapping it, just pretending it's not even there. Usually we need to care about those things because we're dealing with solid objects, but something like this, where it's, you really kind of see one through the other because of that thin veil of that white, doesn't matter. We can put one right over top of the other. And watercolor, being as transparent as it is, works out great. Even though I'm using an opaque color currently. All right, so now I'm just getting a bit messy here, but it doesn't matter. I can just pretty much put anything I want anywhere I want in the middle section, because the little pods, or the little seed heads, the fluffy part just goes all over the place. Kind of going through the stem there. And how are we doing for time? Not bad. Okay, I haven't softened anything on this one, but I could soften a little bit here. And so, see, I'm softening from the outside here. Oh, guess I could use one here. And as I said, I'm not a fan of white in my painting, but I think this is one indication where it can work quite well. Now there's sometimes if you're entering a show or something, they're like, nope, you can't use it, and so you wouldn't enter this one. That's just what it boils down to. But if you just want to enjoy a painting and don't really mind using opaque color, then this is fine. Yeah, and basically this middle area, you can pretty much almost scribble with the white. All right, so I really do think this background, as much as I have some really nice texture and bokeh thing going on there, I think I want to darken it, because I think my dandelion's getting a little bit lost in its background, and you can see how much more prominent it is in the photograph. So I'm going to come back to my A lot of Payne's gray here, but I'm going to mix it in with some of my yellows and get some blues and things in there. And I'm going to work on dry this time. Last time I went wet. And what I will do is I'm going to give it a little bit of a flick to help create the look of the actual dandelion. And yes, some of the texture from the salt will remain, but unfortunately I'm going to lose a lot of it. And as much as possible, I'll try to leave some of those bubbles, and I'll soften those as I go, I guess. So try to paint around some of them, and I will fill them in. They'll look really hard at the moment, but I will come in and soften them. So sometimes it's hard, you know, when you've got a really nice texture and you don't want to mess it up, to come back in and add more like this. But if it's for the betterment of the whole painting, you got to do it, right? So I'm going to take a blotted brush here and paint the middle of this circle here, so it's not too much of a bright circle. All right, and I'm going to just keep coming around and painting in this Payne's gray. I'm going to try to maintain that roundness if I can. I'll even spread out my bristles here and see if I can get this a little bit soft here, sort of flick inward. Okay, so that's working pretty well. Let's get a big circle here, another one here. Quickly rinse my brush. Oh boy, I think I'm going to just get another brush here. And you can see what's happening with this one. The middle of this one's dry and the outside's wet. So let's get the whole thing the same consistency. There we go. Right, and I'll come in here, get this softened up before any of that creates a hard edge on me. See, I'm always starting in the middle and working to the out. Instead of trying to come into it, I'm starting in the middle and working my way out. Right. And yeah, this is a little messy and it doesn't matter. That's the fun part, right? It just doesn't matter. All right, so you can see by darkening this background how much better the seed pod or the dandelion is actually standing out. I'm even going to help define a little bit in here. So for example, I could bring a little bit of this background color into the middle. And I just, you know, tucked in a little bit of this darkness, because if I'm darkening the background, I'm going to be darkening, you know, some of the see-through areas of the seed pod as well. I'm going to find a couple of places where I can do that, and a couple of places being the operative word here. not everywhere, just a few places. Let's soften that. Okay, so I'm going to bring a little bit more color into some of, or a little bit more contrast into some of these other areas. So, brush is pretty wet here. I'm working around a couple of those little circles, and then with my other brush, grab it quick and start in the middle and get those edges so that they don't dry quickly on me, cause problems. Oop, this one too. Don't want to forget this guy up here. Soften this one. And I can definitely lift some out as well. All right, so let's get a little bit neater in here. A little bit more dark. But of course it doesn't make any sense for me to have this dark on this side and then all of a sudden it's a different color on the other side of the stem. That looks a little ridiculous, so of course I have to continue, but it's beginning to look a little bit like a dandelion. I want to get this looking a little bit like the edge of a saw blade kind of thing. It's a little too stark, so I'm gonna take some clean water here and soften that a bit. I don't mind it actually being crisp along the edge of the stem. I think that's okay, because the stem is not one of those areas that needs to be softened. Right, but you can see why it's important to keep going on the other side. Okay, this brush doesn't hold that much water, so I'm going to set this aside for a second and pick up a brush that does. Get some clean water in there. And I'm keeping an eye on stuff that I've already done as well. So sometimes you just kind of get absorbed in what you're doing and you forget to look back to see how things are drying. Yes, I would. Melody, I would definitely start a little darker this if I were doing it again. Yeah. But this shows you that, you know, not all is lost if you didn't. I mean, you could come back and darken a few things. So a little more laborious, I guess, but keep blotting my brush. Don't want to make I don't want to make this background all patchy and everything. I think I could probably do a better job if I just re-wet it, but and Might do that over here. I might just come in and go right through and then lift out. We'll see if I can get this a little bit more fluid. Let's spread out the bristles, because they make a really nice soft flick if you spread them out. That's the one thing you can do with a synthetic, or with a, let me show my palette here, zoom out a little here so you can see what I'm doing. I'm spreading out the bristles like this, and sorry, hit the mic there. So if I spread out the bristles, see, it kind of splays the end, and that's how I can come in with this really nice edge. But I'm pulling the wet paint from the outside to do it with. I'm not just going around the outside with this, because it would look outlined if I did. Okay, so now I will take my synthetic brush and lift out a few areas for my bokeh. With the colors underneath, that should work pretty well. That's better, yeah. So try a couple of different methods, find out what works best. And I'm going to do the same thing here. I'm just going to come up with some really wet paint. Splay out my bristles. Do that little flick thing. All right, so that's coming in a little better, and definitely it stands out more. It looks a little too perfect to me though. Definitely want to splay this out a little bit more. Let it be a little bit uneven, and I can do that a bit with some of the white as well, but yeah. All right, so I could come in with a little bit more white. I'm gonna re-wet this. I'm gonna put more dark in here. Get all of this sort of toned down a little softer. Take that wet color and flick it in towards the dandelion. Okay, would I do it differently? Yeah, I might do it a little bit differently next time, but I kind of like the effect. I think I'd like to get a little more dark in the middle of the center of interest though. Like this core area, the stems themselves could use a little bit more volume. I'm going to put my hand in a lot of wet paint here. Just going to try and get this last little bit here. Okay, so that's kind of nice. I think I'm going to leave that. And I definitely, because I've darkened the background, these look too much like a puff ball. And so I need to get some of this background color showing through some of this. So it needs to come into some of this. And yeah, I'll probably have to come in with a bit of white again, which is fine. I can do that. Not everywhere. Wouldn't make sense to put it everywhere, but in a few places. And not just dark, you can put sort of different values in there, so you can have some lighter, some darker, and some in between. There we go. Bringing in some longer flicks with this darker color here, this background color, bringing in a few more, a little bit. Okay, let's see, look, a few more bits and pieces in here. And I'll probably come in with a little bit more white and just keep adding a little bit more. That'll keep things, you know, some of the newer stuff that I just put on here a lot softer. Because until you do, it looks a little harsh, but it needs a few of those darks in there. It kind of needed it to make it appear transparent, right? You need the background showing through. So otherwise they look like kind of a solid block. Let's see, a little bit up here. Okay, this is getting a little bit of an edge, so I'm softening this right now before it sets up. I'm just blotting a brush and coming in and softening that edge. It's all about softness on this one. Okay, so I think I'm going to leave it there, and I have another class starting soon, so I'm going to wrap this one up. And yeah, so hope you had some fun watching some different techniques, salt and the bokeh background, and adding bits of white and lifting off the stems to show the see-through part aspect of it and things like that. This isn't exactly a keeper, this painting, but it was fun watching the techniques. I hope you learned something about keeping things soft, and you know, if I wanted, I could still come in and lighten up stuff. Just use a damp brush and I could lift out some more little circles if I want to make some of these a little bit brighter. Just take a dry paper towel, make your circle, and blot it, and you pull off some of the colors. And it's easy to do that when you have a really dark background because there's so much pigment sitting on the surface, so you can pull quite a bit up with your brush. Oh, hi, Jane. Thank you. Let's see, I'm gonna just lift a couple more here and get that bokeh background. I love that. I love that look. You know, that out of focus kind of thing. I think it's so pretty. And you know, these bokeh circles, shall we call them? They can overlap too. So I could put one over another, and that happens all the time with that. It's just depends on what's in the background. So anyway, thanks so much for joining. I'm glad you found me here, and yeah. So I think next week I'll do the YouTube again live. I actually had you know, I'm finding that even on Facebook now, I can't seem to even like a comment that somebody's made. But it freezes up. It's like, yeah, I'm just trying to like something, you know, and it's like not working. So I don't know, for some reason my Facebook is gone really glitchy on me, and I'm having so many troubles with it. So next week we will do the same place, same time. All right, so see you on YouTube next week. Thank you so much for joining, and have a great week, guys. Bye.